Riots in Tel Aviv, which will have far-reaching implications for the Eritrean refugee community in Israel. On Saturday, violent clashes occurred outside the Eritrean embassy between those in favour and against the East African nation's government ahead of the 30th anniversary of independence, leaving over 100 injured, a dozen critically. African migration has been a controversial issue in Israel for decades, and now the spotlight is shining on it even stronger, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promising that all, quote, illegal infiltrators will be deported. Whilst it is illegal under international law to deport asylum seekers back to places where they would be in danger, as they may be if they were to return to Eritrea, a country with a poor human rights record, especially towards political dissidents. As the government mulls its next steps, would it be the right decision to deport the Eritrean troublemakers, or is there a better strategy? The police have been both praised and criticised for its handling of the clashes, firing stun grenades, tear gas, and rounds of live ammunition. Were these actions too far, or justified? Is there a double standard between asylum seekers based on skin colour? How should the Israeli government react to the Eritrean clashes?
So let's get to it. How should the Israeli government react to the Eritrean clashes? Dear panelists, as always, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each to out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick it up from there. So Sigal Rozen, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
First, there is a need to check the evidence for each one of the 50 detainees, both demonstrators and regime supporters. In cases where there is evidence for crime, there is a need to bring to trial the offenders, the same way it is being done to Israeli offenders. We heard today ministers talking about unlimited administrative detention and even deportation of asylum seekers, and we are here to remind that such practices cannot exist in democracies. In addition, we recommend that the Israeli government start checking the asylum claims of Eritreans, even though they will probably find out, okay. Almost all of them are entitled to refugees status.
Yes, we will continue, of course, to unpack it in a split second. We will just conclude the first opening round. Amir Weitmann, your thoughts?
Well, unfortunately, the guilty party for these yesterday's events is really the Supreme Court of Justice, which has over the years impaired the government's ability to deal effectively with these infiltrators, who probably would have almost all of them left the country if it was not for the systematic instruction that the High Court has inserted into government's policy. What needs to be done is to expel all of them, send them back to their countries, and let them live their lives happily ever after. They are not here.
And we cannot start a conversation without the opening remarks of Dan Perry.
I think cracking down on the rioters, who showed quite a bit of chutzpah, is not unwarranted. But I would hope the government experiences a learning moment that spurs understanding that their transparent policy of trying to compel the Eritreans and others to leave by means of petty abuses like denying them work permits and basic social protections may not be the way to go. What's needed is a bit of sagacity and a bit of generosity, qualities that are perhaps in short supply in government circles at present.
Well, might very well be. And let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards. And I usually find hindsight discussions a bit null, but this time around, I do want us to begin by asking whether it was a police failure, because members of the Eritrean community were alerting police that violence might be spiraling in such an event. Question being, could that have been prevented? Some suggesting that police did not treat the community's leaders' warnings, perhaps partially because of racism. Amir Weitmann.
Now, listen, this is ridiculous. Okay, frankly, trying to reflect racism into everything that has to do with this issue is a blatant lie, and it's offensive and it's wrong. Okay, now I don't know if the police did everything they could do, but whether they was some level of I would say of failure or not, this has nothing to do with racism. Police is under a lot of stress in different fronts, facing the terrible wave of terror that we've been living over the past few months from the Palestinians, for the demonstration all over the place. So yes, maybe they did not do everything that they expected, maybe have been expected to be done in this case, but that has nothing to do with racism.
All right, and let's jump to today. Let's take a quick listen to Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu at the opening of today's cabinet meeting about what should be done from this point onwards. Let's take a listen.
Now there remains the serious problem of the illegal infiltrators in southern Tel Aviv and other places. But what happened yesterday crossed a red line. This is rioting, it is bloodshed, it is savageness that we cannot accept. Therefore, the first thing that I'm doing is to wish recovery to the policemen who were injured in the effort to restore order. We're seeking strong steps against the rioters, including the immediate expulsion of those who took part. It is hard for me to understand why we would have a problem with those who declare that they support the regime. They certainly cannot claim refugee status.
And Sigal Rozen, you alluded to it in your opening remarks, and a double question here, if you will. A, should rioters be deported? And B, is it all a manifestation of the lack of a distinction between Eritrean regime supporters and opponents?
First of all, there is a problem to deport to Eritrea because Isaias Afwerki, the dictator, refused to accept people by force. Mm-hmm. But regime supporters, they don't need to be deported. They can leave the country whenever they want. They have no problem returning to Eritrea. They have no problem with the regime. But this is not the case with the asylum seekers who protested against this event. The reason they protested against this event is because the event was meant to collect funds for the dictatorial regime from which they escaped.
Yeah. Dan Perry.
I think this business of regime supporters is a little bit of a red herring. I mean, most of the people who arrive in Israel are obviously not regime supporters. The horrible, criminal, dictatorial regime of Afwerki does not have any real supporters outside of its immediate circles and their family members. What might have been done is to not allow the representative of that criminal regime, which is the embassy in Israel, to hold their event. I fail to see why that was permitted. Incredible weakness displayed there, nor why the police and others indeed ignored the warnings of the community leadership in Israel, which of course overwhelmingly opposes the regime. And I'm in no way justifying or defending the riots, but it clearly was going to happen. There's precedent elsewhere in Sweden and Canada, and other countries have known enough to basically shut down these events that spark such riots.
So, Amir Weitmann, this issue has been at the epicenter, I wouldn't say of Israeli attention per se, but when it comes to the residents of southern Tel Aviv, it's a daily reality that they've been alerting. Is a bombshell ready to detonate any day now? Has Israel lost sovereignty rather, in those neighborhoods in southern Tel Aviv?
No, we have a problem, it's clear, but I want to remind everybody that a few years ago, there were over 65,000 illegal infiltrators coming from Eritrea and Sudan. In Israel, this number has been almost halved to around 35,000. And that includes, by the way, the kids who were born here. So in reality, more than half of these people actually left. And again, if it was not for the Supreme Court, which did everything it can to make it almost impossible for the Israeli government to effectively act against this infiltration, this illegal infiltration into Israel, the problem would have been solved by now. There probably would be very, 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 very few.
What would you have had the Supreme Court do, Mr. Weitzman, exactly?
Well,
the Supreme Court could not possibly have permitted the government to deport.
The Supreme Court, everything took,
Good Lord.
I don't know, 10 decisions over the past 10 years canceling government decisions, government laws. If all these decisions had not been made, and if the Supreme Court had simply let the government do its job, which is to protect the Israeli citizens, these people would not be in Israel. And by the way, just to link this debate with what has been happening in Israel over the past 8 months, you guys actually are responsible for everything that has been happening in this country over in the past few months. Because if this issue, which is one of the main issues that has been disturbing the Israeli population over the past decade, had been solved, we would not be now where we are. This needs to be solved. Government needs to take strong measures to get these people out of Israel and back into their countries or to third country. By the way, there was also an agreement reached with Rwanda, which was cancelled by
there's a limit. There's a limit. The right-wing governments of Israel typically and systematically propose action that they know is illegal and in their heart of hearts they know is wrong, and they wait for the Supreme Court to strike it down. Israel, under international obligations, cannot, please let me finish as I did you, cannot legally deport these people back to Eritrea, end of story, and other countries in Africa. They never were going to do it. The Supreme Court had to strike it down. The facility in the Negev, whose existence was a bit of a disgrace, also had to be shut down. What's really happening here is that you are taking, I'm sad to say, a problem that is one of the major philosophical questions in the world today. What to do with migrants and whether rich countries have an obligation to accept them, and if so, how many? And you're trying to reduce it to the pettiness of the current squabble in Israel over the Supreme Court. And in so doing, wheeling out these talking points against the court. Honestly, it's beneath you and pitiful.
All right, Sigal, before we take a short break, wrap it up for us. Yeah.
We are not talking about migrants. We are talking about refugees here. Just because Israel doesn't check the asylum claims doesn't make them less of a refugees. These are refugees all over the world. Eritreans are being recognized in around 90% as refugees. Israel doesn't check them, so they don't find any
even
refugees.
If some are migrants, they could be migrants or refugees at the same time. How about that Israel should actually examine their asylum requests? Israel's proportion of examining these asylum requests may be the lowest on earth. Is that a light unto the nations? It's a disgrace.
We don't want to have these people here. It is our right to protect our borders.
No kidding.
These people, by the way, have not
it's not our right. If we want to continue to be a democracy, it is not
to take
our
these
right.
people in. They have to go back to their countries. End of discussion.
Not the end of discussion, but the end of the first part of the discussion. We are taking a short break, but when we get back, we obviously have so much more to unpack. Amir Weitmann, Sigal Rozen, Dan Perry, you're staying with us a few minutes, and we're back with the summit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Sigal Rozen, Public Policy Coordinator at the Hotline for Migrants and Refugees, head of the Libertarian Caucus at the Likud Party, Amir Weitmann, and Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst. Thank you all very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, but before we get back to our conversation, it was truly perhaps one of the biggest policy zigzags, if you will. It was back in 2018 when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a celebratory announcement of a groundbreaking outline to deport illegal infiltrators to a third country and then keeping a quota of others. But due to fierce right-wing backlash, short hours after, was reversed. Netanyahu taking it back. But this is how he sounded. The Prime Minister sounded this morning.
We proposed a series of measures, and unfortunately, they were all rejected by the High Court. One thing we did not propose, and it was a good thing we did not propose it, is the UN outline. The UN outline would have naturalized 16,000 illegal infiltrators and would have created a tremendous incentive for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Africans who would flood into the state of Israel again. Therefore, this is a bad solution. Whoever proposes this proposes something that will set back the problem to its original state.
So let's get to it. Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Should the UN outline have been next to begin with, and should it be revived now? Amir Weitmann, your 30 seconds are on. Please take the lead.
No, I think I remember very clearly these events in 2018. It was a mistake at the beginning of the time of the Prime Minister to accept it, and it's good that he changed his mind. And yes, it would have been a very bad mistake to accept this outline. We should not give any permanent status to any of these people. They should all find themselves back into their countries. The sooner, the better for Israel and for everybody, as we saw, unfortunately, yesterday with this terrible violence in Tel Aviv.
Dan Perry, your thoughts?
Well, Netanyahu himself had proposed it, so let's be kind and say that he seems to be confused about the chronology behind his plan. It wasn't perfect, but it would have deported about half of them and given the other half a more decent arrangement that included some rights. It would have ended the shoddy treatment and projected to the world that Israel will do its little bit to help alleviate this massive problem. In the end, it was a Solomonic plan. And as that is not the word that comes to mind when you examine the current state of affairs, I'm not betting the farm that it will be revived.
Sigal Rozen, your take?
Well, first, the oral outline intended to provide status only for 5 years. It wasn't a permanent status at all, and it wasn't even a refugee status. Second, it was a disgrace. It was a disgrace to Israel because instead of providing refuge to the torture camp survivors in Libya at the time, Western developed countries were ready to absorb refugees from Israel only because they were abused by the Israeli government. Yet, for this specific government, no doubt the UN outline is the best deal that they can hope for.
And let's circle back to what we began discussing in the previous part of our conversation. The claims that the Supreme Court is essentially paralyzing policy making here. Sigal Rozen.
Well, first of all, we are very unhappy with the decisions of the High Court of Justice. Right now, for example, there are being talks about reviving the criminal procedure that the High Court of Justice again and again refused to make a principled decision about and leaving it vague the way it is now. We hear a lot that Cholot was closed as a result of a High Court decision, and that is not correct. The government decided to close Cholot. It has nothing to do with the High Court of Justice. The High Court of Justice assisted by abrogating the deposit law that prevent asylum seekers from collecting funds and saving money in order to move to Canada quicker.
Yeah.
Right now, every year, 2,000 refugees are moving to Canada every year. They could have done it much quicker if the government wouldn't stop them by putting on them so many deposits and taxes.
And as we're nearing the end of our conversation, Amir Weitmann, you briefly mentioned it earlier, we do need to take it all in the greater scheme of things, perhaps. Is the state of Israel losing its monopoly of power? We're seeing it in multiple arenas domestically.
I hope not, but yes, one point is clear, is that if we allow people who do not accept Israeli sovereignty, who do not recognize Israel as being the legitimate state here, be here, then this consequences. We have to understand that these people are not friends of Israel, they're not friends of Israel. They are hostile in a very large measure to us. They're not the only ones here who are hostile to us. These people here, and a price, and you have to understand that there's a price to be paid for having people here, and if you refuse
the incompetence,
recognize that there's a price, then we will carry on paying it.
The incompetence and lack of strategy is really mesmerizing here. They let in more people than they needed to because the border was wide open and ended up with a larger number than maybe is even reasonable, but they did nothing decent with any of them. The actual asylum requests accepted by Israel are a tiny handful, which makes Israel have all these people it doesn't want, but also look unkind. It's just very bad. And realistically, the issue here is demographic. And if you zoom out just a little bit, this is a government that is destroying Israel's Jewish majority by insisting on colonization of the West Bank. Meanwhile, they're so upset about 20,000 Africans. This is penny wise and pound foolish is a phrase that comes to mind, except the magnitude of idiocy, the factor is much more than 100.
Well, I wouldn't say silver lining because it's really not a term to be used in this context, but from this point onwards, will the issue of asylum seekers from Eritrea get back to the limelight, or are we days away from national Alzheimer's, Sigal?
I hope very much that maybe something positive will now happen. Up until now, we have now 18,000 Eritrean refugees in Israel. The country only recognized less than 30 of them, less than 30. And that's while all around the world, almost 90% of them are being recognized as refugees. The right way to deal with this problem is to check asylum claims, to give status to those who deserve the status. It's not a permanent status, as you said. It's a status only until it will be possible for them to go back, knowing the Eritrean community, many of them really eager to go back.
Sigal, it's if I may, just a tiny little bit disingenuous, though, because it's not a technical matter of who's a migrant and who's a genuine political escapee. At the end of the day, there is a big philosophical question here of whether richer countries like Israel have a duty to accept people that they don't really want. And I don't think there's a right answer here, but there's a discussion that genuinely should be had. I would even challenge Mr. Weitmann to answer whether you believe that Israel, as a light unto the nations, has a duty to accept any of them.
No, we have our duty to protect the Jewish people and therefore keep people like that out of the country as much as possible and make sure that, yes, humanly they are being sent back to their countries, of course, but they should not be here.
So humanity and the moral imperative are very small incentives for you.
Israel has a duty to the Jewish people, not to non-Jews. I'm sorry, we are very small people.
But we have a legal obligation here.
We have to protect ourselves and keep these people out.
So tribalism at the expense of humanity is the height of your ambition.
You keep your globalism where it belongs, and this sort of attitude essentially keeps the Jews in a bad position because we're surrounded by people who want to do us harm, and therefore we have to protect ourselves. And yes, this entails keeping these sort of people out of our country. The world is big enough to accommodate them, and first of all, they should go back to their own countries and make them work instead of simply,
otherwise known as passing the buck.
Yes,
these are victims of a dictatorial regime. They don't want to harm us. They are looking for refuge.
All right.
How can you not see
I have a feeling that we will not be solving this hot potato policy item in the 10 seconds we have left. Dan Perry, Sigal Rozen, Amir Weitmann, thank you very much for your time, your insight. We appreciate it.
Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.